Hey everyone, Chris here. Thanks for checking out the podcast. If you're enjoying it and learning something along with us, please consider becoming a supporting patron at patreon.com/ateachershistory. Or you could leave a rating and review on iTunes. It would be a huge help. If you'd like to raise your hand and participate along with us, you can find us on Facebook, Twitter, @ateachersfist, or shoot me an email, chris@ateachershistory.com. All right, let's get on to the next episode. Hello, welcome into A Teacher's History of the United States. Thanks so much for joining me again today. Did you know that following Thomas Jefferson's retirement from politics, he helped to build and create the University of Virginia, something that he included on his epitaph, whereas he didn't include anything about his presidency. And that the impressment by the British Royal Navy that was one of the primary causes of the War of 1812 actually began during Jefferson's second term, while James Madison was Secretary of State. And in the election of 1808, James Monroe, a neighbor of James Madison, ran against Madison again, this time at the urging of John Randolph, and much to the disappointment of President Jefferson. Did you know all of this? Maybe, maybe not. Get your notebooks out because today we will cover that and more in episode 97, Introducing President Madison. All right, everyone, welcome in to episode 97. I have two book recommendations for today, and these are two books that I've really been diving into a lot over the last 2 weeks. Both of them are biographies, so to speak, on James Madison. The first is The Three Lives of James Madison, Genius, Partisan, and President by Noah Feldman, which is an incredibly all-encompassing biography of James Madison and gives a great third-person perspective on Madison's life and political life specifically. And the second is Madison's Gift, 5 Partnerships That Built America by David O. Stewart, which is a bit of a different take on Madison and examines the 5 different partnerships or friendships that he created throughout his life that helped him create the America that we know today and gave him the power and influence in politics that he is known for today. We have 2 new patrons since our last episode, Frank Sousa and Kristen Jolly. Thank you so much for supporting the show and being patrons. It means a lot to us. Also, thanks to everyone for your patience. I had death in the family last week, and I was out of work for a few days and out of the didn't quite have the right mindset for the podcast. So I know it took an extra week to get episode 97 out, and I appreciate your patience. So let's dive into it. Last week, we left off saying goodbye to President Thomas Jefferson, one of the most famous Americans of all time and one of the most impactful presidents in our nation's young history. Today, we will welcome the 4th President of the United States, Thomas Jefferson's right-hand man, James Madison, the Robin to Jefferson's Batman. We've spoken about Madison at length throughout the course of this podcast, and from his time at the Constitutional Convention to the Virginia Convention and leading the opposition against Hamilton and all those other high-minded Federalists during the Washington and Adams presidencies. In the election of 1808, Madison rode the coattails of the incredibly popular Thomas Jefferson to a sweeping electoral college victory, becoming the 4th president of the United States. Madison's service under Jefferson as his Secretary of State and transition into the White House will be our primary focus in today's podcast. But before we get into that, let's finish wrapping up Jefferson's political impact as he faded into the political background, so to speak, for the first time in his adult life. Well, sort of. In 1808, Thomas Jefferson decided to hang it up, ending his long tenure in national politics. As we mentioned on a previous podcast, Jefferson had kicked around the idea of running for a third term, if he deemed it absolutely necessary, but in the end recognized that keeping with the tradition and finishing after 2 terms was the right move, not only for him personally, but also for the nation. Jefferson retired to his beautiful home, Monticello, which is just outside of Charlottesville, Virginia, which makes a lot of sense because a decade after he retired, he founded and began building the University of Virginia. Jefferson donated his books to the Library of Congress and spent most of his days rising early, writing letters back and forth to those still engaged in the political scene. He served as a critical source of mentorship for both James Madison and subsequently James Monroe in their presidencies for really the next couple decades, allowing his political theory to continue to impact the White House. Oh, and don't forget, for 14 years after his retirement, Jefferson also exchanged over 150 letters with John Adams, a friendship that was rekindled in 1809. Just like George Washington's retirement, most evenings at Monticello were spent traveling around the plantation and ensuring that things were properly taken care of, followed by the seeming inevitable entertaining of guests who stopped by to spend the evening or even a couple days trying to bask in the presence of this great American before he passed away. But the founding of the University of Virginia was something that Thomas Jefferson was just incredibly proud of. Jefferson's religious views were pretty complicated, but it's widely accepted that he would be a 21st century version of a deist. With that in mind, he wanted to create a university that was free from church influence, and he wanted people to get into school based on ability, not necessarily social stature. Jefferson purchased the location for the University of Virginia, designed the buildings himself, and was even the first rector when it finally opened in 1825. And like I mentioned, Jefferson was incredibly proud of this, as his own epitaph doesn't even mention his presidency, but does mention his work for the university. It says, quote, "Here was buried Thomas Jefferson, author of the Declaration of American Independence, of the Statue of Virginia for Religious Freedom, and father of the University of Virginia." In 1821, at the age of 77, while working on the creation of UVA, he also sat down and wrote an autobiography, one that focused on his work during the Revolutionary period and his formation of his political values. It's an autobiography that, unsurprisingly, left out any and all mention of Sally Hemings, rumors about his personal life, and the children he may had borne with her. In 1824, per the request of President Monroe, the Marquis de Lafayette visited the United States, and after spending some time in New York and New England, he decided to make the trip down to Monticello to visit his old friend and fellow revolutionary, Thomas Jefferson, who he hadn't seen in 35 years, since 1789. According to Jefferson's grandson, the two men were ecstatic to see each other, crying out each other's names upon Lafayette's arrival and bursting into tears as they embraced. Lafayette stayed at Monticello for 11 days, a time that was surely one of the highlights of Jefferson's retirement. 2 years after Lafayette's visit, Jefferson realized his time was coming to an end. Heavily in debt, he was despondent about what his legacy would be for his family and concerned about the physical ailments that he was beginning to suffer from. With the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence approaching, Jefferson was invited to Washington, D.C. to join in on the celebration. With his illness becoming more and more prohibitive, though, he declined the invitation, likely knowing that he didn't have much time left. And what has always struck me, personally, as the most incredible coincidence in American history, and heck, world history maybe, Thomas Jefferson died on the afternoon of July 4th, 1826, the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. And John Adams died the same day on the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. And Adams' final words were, quote, "Thomas Jefferson survives." Little did he know, Jefferson had died earlier that day. I mean, just incredible stuff. So with Jefferson's retirement and later life taken care of, let's turn our attention to the 4th President of the United States, James Madison. As you likely know, James Madison not only participated at the Constitutional Convention, was a member of the Confederation Congress, was a member of the Virginia House of Representatives, was a member of the U.S. House of Representatives. But for the last 8 years of this podcast narrative, Madison had been serving as Jefferson's Secretary of State and was a trusted advisor to the president. During Madison's 8 years as Secretary of State, he not only saw the unique challenges that the first Democratic-Republican president ran into, but was also able to gauge the political landscape both home and abroad. Madison was included in the most pertinent and sensitive political issues of Jefferson's presidency, giving him a unique perspective and preparation for the challenges that lay ahead for him. As Secretary of State, he, in some ways, served as a co-president to Jefferson. His primary intent was to help Jefferson navigate the complicated relationship between the United States, France, Britain, Spain, and the rest of the international political world, trying to find a way to get these countries to respect the U.S. as the independent, burgeoning nation that these two men believed us to be. Madison began his time as Secretary of State on May 1st, 1801. He had been delayed while mourning the death of his father. Madison and his wife Dolly actually moved into the White House with Jefferson, with Dolly serving as the unofficial role of the quasi-First Lady, especially since Aaron Burr, the vice president, was a widower, just like Jefferson. James and Dolly moved out of the White House a month later, but Dolly remained the most influential woman in D.C. for the next 15 years. And this was important, as Dolly was a social butterfly and was incredibly charming. Jefferson and Madison took over the White House after the most partisan election America had ever seen, and politically the nation was divided. Dolly did her best to try to bridge the gap for any that were entertained at her home or at the White House. As Madison began to settle in to his role as Secretary of State, he was a bit intimidated by the task. While he was a political whiz kid, pretty much all of his experience was in domestic affairs, not foreign. He immediately had to deal with the bribery demands from the Barbary states, or else deal with pirated attacks on American shipping. Should they fight the pirates, or just pay the bribe and get on with their commerce? And as a side note, the term Barbary Coast was a term used by Europeans during this time to describe the northern coast of Africa, right on the Mediterranean Sea. So the countries that would make up this region, the Barbary states, are today Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, and Libya. Anyways, there were quite a few Americans who were looking to pick a fight with these pirates, and Madison and Jefferson both knew it was important that America be taken seriously abroad. With this in mind, Madison had urged Jefferson to send a few ships over to reinforce their demand for respect, which Jefferson did. This expedition was intended to show the Barbary states that America wasn't going to just sit back and allow them to keep harassing American shipping. After some blockading and small skirmishes with the Barbary ships, Jefferson soon realized that this was not a war worth fighting. But nonetheless, Madison's bold action proved to everyone that he was not going to be as cautious of a Secretary of State as many had predicted. The most significant issue that Madison faced as Secretary of State, though, was the growing power of France, something that we've covered quite a bit. Now, we know that eventually Napoleon acquired the Louisiana Territory from the Spanish, hoping to be able to create his own North American empire. But eventually, as we also know, Napoleon gave up on this idea and sold Louisiana to the United States for pennies an acre. During these negotiations, Madison had been advising Robert Livingston to be aggressive in finding out Napoleon's plans for Louisiana and how much it may cost to acquire Florida and the port of New Orleans. Madison recognized that all eyes were on America during these negotiations, and taking Madison's lead, Livingston tried to convince Napoleon that governing Louisiana and growing an empire in North America was definitely not in France's best interest. After Livingston and Monroe were able to finally acquire the Louisiana Territory, Jefferson created a draft of an amendment, something that Madison then revised, which he had a tendency to do with President Jefferson. Madison felt that naming Louisiana specifically was short-sighted and could prevent them from also annexing Florida in the future. Madison and Jefferson, as you may remember, eventually scrapped this idea because of time constraints, but instead went to Congress for passage. Madison then directed Jefferson to take it to both houses. Madison, the father of the Constitution, also recommended that no one mention how this is potentially an action that violated the Constitution. Madison wanted this elephant in the room ignored as much as possible. While Madison, Jefferson, Livingston, and Monroe were trying to get one over on Talleyrand and Napoleon, Madison then found himself distracted by a problem much closer to home, the court case of Marbury v. Madison. As we discussed in episode 93, Madison refused to give commissions to the Federalist-leaning justices of the peace in Washington, D.C., William Marbury, particularly perturbed by this reality. This was something that was blatantly disregarding the laws and expectations of the position of Secretary of State. But interestingly enough, this case showed that Madison's own document, the Constitution, was far more flexible than he realized, and the lifelong terms that federal justices were given in the Constitution would prove to be a thorn in the side for the Democratic Republicans for years to come. In Madison's second term as Secretary of State, he found himself once again deeply embroiled in foreign affairs. When the tension with Britain began to reach a fever pitch following the impressment of American sailors and harassing of American shipping, Madison cleverly created a tenet of republicanism that didn't really exist: the idea that war should be avoided at all cost. Instead, Madison proposed very early in the process that economic sanctions should be used to avoid conflict, which was a policy that coincidentally Madison then promised to do away with in the election of 1808, something we'll talk about in more detail shortly. But before we start talking about American shipping being harassed by England, I want to take a moment to explain what exactly was going on at this time. And this is critically important because it is the foundation for one of the justifications for war with Britain in the War of 1812. So listen closely here. In August of 1805, France and England were at each other's throats once again, which you may remember, and Britain was on high alert for any action that could theoretically give France an advantage. Britain was still pretty pissed about the Louisiana Purchase, and they were wary of the United States continuing to assist France, either directly or indirectly. Britain had a law called the, quote, Rule of 1756. This rule said that, and listen closely, Britain would not allow the ships of neutral countries to engage in trade during wartime that had not been available to them during time of peace. So basically Britain's saying, we recognize that during wartime, different economic opportunities pop up for various neutral countries. But if the opportunity is only there because we are at war with another country, we're not going to allow you to take advantage of it. Basically, they wanted to prevent third-party neutral countries from profiting off of a war that they were embroiled in and falling deeper into debt because of. This was particularly relevant when it came to France and her colonies, because, see, during peacetime, the United States of America was not allowed to ship French goods from her colonies in the West Indies over to Europe. Of course not, right? And that's the whole purpose of a colony, is for France to be doing that, not the U.S. But when war broke out with Britain, the French found themselves needing more ships and someone to deliver their goods from their colonies to Europe. Enter the United States. U.S. ships would go to the French colonies and then make a stopover in the U.S. prior to sailing to Europe. This way they could claim that they were coming from the United States, technically. This was actually so common that they had a name for it. It was called the, quote, Broken Voyage. Unfortunately for the U.S., the British Admiralty Court in June of 1805 decided that they were no longer going to continue to allow this. Basically, what this means is that the British now had free rein to stop any American vessel that was headed toward France or toward Europe. Britain explained that you were not able to ship French goods from her colonies to France during times of peace, so now that we're at war with France and the French are low on ships, we're not going to allow you to profit off of it and ship French goods now. James Monroe, the ambassador in London, was livid, but there was nothing he could do about it, no matter how much he complained. Interestingly enough, Jefferson and Madison had not heard about the ruling from the Admiralty Court. Jefferson, at this time, was even kicking around the idea of siding with Britain in order to cement their hold over Louisiana and the French, and potentially swipe Florida from the French allied Spanish. Madison disagreed, telling Jefferson that this would only drag them into war, something that Madison was wholly against, and would not be in the best interest of the United States. It was at this point that Madison proposed that Jefferson consider an embargo on Britain and other nations that the U.S. traded with. Madison recognized that the greatest strength of the United States was its commercial impact on the world stage. This would have been an extremely bold action and something that had never been formally tried in major international relations. While we know that the embargo did not work out well for Jefferson and Madison, Madison's advice to Jefferson to stay out of any and all public alliances with Britain was definitely very good advice. In the fall of 1805, Monroe wrote to Jefferson and Madison that Britain had taken to the practice of impressment. This meant that British ships were stopping American merchant ships, going on board and checking the citizenship papers of the men. If they found that one of them was born a Briton, an Irishman, or a Scottish citizen, whether they had gained American citizenship since then didn't matter. Britain would more or less seize them or kidnap them and force them back into the Royal Navy. Monroe continued to describe that Britain was wantonly stopping American ships and was being very aggressive in their harassment. The British claim that many British sailors were in fact deserting the Royal Navy and British merchant ships in order to serve on American ships. And to be fair, this was happening at an alarming rate to Britain, and they didn't know what to do about it. On the other side of the coin, though, you can understand how this action, from an American perspective, is totally unacceptable. On top of that, rumors were circulating wildly that the British weren't just, seizing men who were formerly citizens of Britain, Scotland, or Ireland, but they were seizing all kinds of men. And they were definitely even kidnapping American citizens, men who were born in the United States of America. So, when Jefferson and Madison found out about this impressment, they were both furious. Things became significantly worse when the USS Chesapeake was fired upon off the American coast by the HMS Leopard, something that we've mentioned in a previous episode. The British then impressed, so get this, the British then impressed 4 men from the USS Chesapeake, and it was later found out that 3 of those 4 men were actually born and raised in the United States of America. Once again, reinforcing this idea that the British are just wantonly pulling these ships over, boarding these ships, and taking American citizens from American ships and forcing them into indentured servitude in the Royal Navy. So this was actually happening. As mentioned last episode, the American public was furious, but it did give Jefferson and Madison an opportunity to do something about this harassment. British armed ships were banned from American waters and American ports, but that didn't really stop Britain. Things only got worse for Jefferson and Madison. At one point, the British blockaded the port of Norfolk, and in Halifax, they hung a British deserter and had another one die while he was being furiously whipped 500 times for his desertion. To make matters worse, Britain was making all ships traveling to Europe stop in Britain first, before heading on to other countries in Europe, while Napoleon was outlawing all trade in French-controlled regions that had stopped in Britain. So it looked like this war between France and Britain that Madison had so badly wanted American citizens and merchants to profit off of was not really going well for anyone. Now we know that after all of this drama, Jefferson and Madison did pass an embargo, cutting off all trade to Europe. This is something that, as I mentioned, was recommended by Madison years earlier and was finally endorsed by Jefferson in 1807. We know that the embargo was a failure, but why exactly? Well, if you're going to pass an embargo like the one Jefferson and Madison did in 1807, you better hope that it works and it works quickly. This embargo was going to cripple American trade and industry. That was obvious. The problem the U.S. ran into was that Britain found trade in the Spanish colonies, at least enough to get them by. And the French were making do. So the embargo was backfiring. It was actually hurting the U.S. significantly more than it was hurting Britain or France. And one of the reasons was numerous American ships were finding ways around the embargo without a lot of effort. In pretty much every way, the embargo was failing. These ships would say, oh yeah, no, I'm sailing to this other American city. And then they would head off and then sail straight to Europe. And you can imagine how impossible it would be to have any type of enforcement or policing of these illegal activities. As the election of 1808 was nearing, the popularity of the Republican Party was beginning to wane a bit. On top of this, there was some drama within the party itself. If you remember last episode, there was a gentleman named John Randolph, a representative who had written and spoke a scathing rebuke of Thomas Jefferson and, to an extent, James Madison, saying that they were not Republican enough and they were becoming too Federalist. Well, that same John Randolph was in the ear of one Mr. James Monroe. With Monroe returning from Britain, he was frustrated by the lack of support he got from Madison and was insulted by Jefferson's offer of governorship of the Louisiana Territory. Jefferson saw what was unfolding, and it was the last thing he wanted as he entered retirement. James Monroe, being egged on by John Randolph, was planning to run for president against James Madison. Jefferson more or less begged Monroe not to do it, but Monroe pushed forward with the plan. In a situation that was eerily reminiscent of the campaign for the congressional seat in Virginia in 1793, these two Virginia neighbors were once again running against each other. But Madison won overwhelmingly in the Republican caucus. Many of them liked both men, but they desperately wanted to show unity and threw all of their weight behind Madison. It was a clear message to Monroe. If you are a man of the party and a friend of unity, you won't continue to challenge Madison. But Monroe and his allies, John Randolph specifically, pushed forward, with many of Madison's enemies and Monroe's supporters writing scathing rebukes about Madison and his electability. Madison's writing of the Federalist Papers with none other than Alexander Hamilton, his compromise over the Bill of Rights during the Constitutional Convention, and his support of executive authority during the embargo were allowing Madison's enemies in the Republican Party to paint him as much more of a Federalist than a Republican. The campaign of 1808 saw the embargo take center stage. This was an epic disaster and was a French tool that was supposed to lead to war, at least that's what Madison's detractors claimed. These same detractors then claimed that Monroe had been able to negotiate peace with Britain only to have Madison not allow it. So it looked like Monroe was doing everything he could to keep things peaceful, whereas Madison and Jefferson were trying to drive us into war. But Madison had become a pretty savvy politician at this point in his career, and he wasn't backing down. He called their bluff. He said, fine, take all of my letters that I have saved that had been written back and forth during the embargo, publish them and read them aloud to Congress, and you will see exactly where I stand. This is actually something that Alexander Hamilton, this is the same type of thing Alexander Hamilton did when the Republicans were crushing him about the National Bank and saying that he was pilfering and profiting off of it. And he said, well, fine, take all of the information and cull through it and present it to Congress and show that I, in fact, did not do this. Well, Madison took a page out of Hamilton's book and took a similar approach to this. It was a smashing success. These letters proved that Madison was in favor of neutrality all along and was taking a strong stand against impressment. This, interestingly enough, made Madison look like the tough negotiator, while Monroe, the man who was trying to strike a deal, looked like the weaker politician. As Jefferson was stepping down from office, France and Britain had not budged. The embargo was an albatross hovering over Jefferson and, to an extent, Madison. But in his farewell speech, Thomas Jefferson explained that the embargo was a bold action and one that he believed would help the United States. But unfortunately, he admitted that it had not been successful. Jefferson then stated that the acknowledgement that the embargo was a failure opened the opportunity to do away with it in the near future. This speech worked wonders for the electability of James Madison, which makes sense considering he was the one that wrote the speech in the first place. I mean, you didn't actually think that Madison wasn't doing Jefferson's speech writing, did you? Madison took advantage of Jefferson's acceptance of responsibility, and he campaigned on a platform that stressed the removal of his embargo. Now his opponents were stuck. They could no longer claim the embargo was some type of plot to lure the U.S. into an alliance with France. On top of this, the only thing they could really do was claim that it was a bad idea in the first place, something that Jefferson more or less already admitted. Jefferson and Madison have figured out a way to take the bullets out of their political opponent's chamber. But in addition to this, if they were to then carry the argument that the embargo was a bad idea, which was sort of easy to say, they would need to offer some type of alternative. And since the only alternative would have been to do absolutely nothing or to go to war, their complaint sort of fell on deaf ears because people weren't big fans of those options either. In a sweeping victory, Madison received 122 electoral votes to his Federalist opponent Charles Pinckney's 47. George Clinton, a fellow Republican, received 6 votes, and James Monroe, 0. Congress then moved to repeal the embargo on March 4th, 1809, Madison's first day in office. Madison entered office on an incredible wave of momentum. He had endorsed a failed policy, admitted to it failing, then supported removing it. His own policy. And the admission of failure and embrace of its removal made him pretty popular, which is really incredible to consider in hindsight. But he wasn't popular everywhere. The 5 Middle and New England states that voted for Pinckney passed resolutions standing up against what they viewed was an unconstitutional power grab from Jefferson and Madison during the 1807 embargo, and implied that they all needed to unite together to avoid Madison from taking advantage of them once again. But as we find out, while the United States under Jefferson and Madison had chosen the route of an embargo over direct conflict with Britain, Madison wouldn't be so lucky as president. As you pack up your things, I'd like you to consider the impact that the impressment of American ships and sailors and the subsequent embargo had on the American political landscape. I know that this episode was a bit unique in that we rehashed some previously reviewed content, only changing the perspective and providing more context. But I think it's really important to understand the complicated relationship that Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, and the U.S. government had with Britain leading up to Madison's presidency, as it will come to a head in the War of 1812, arguably the most overlooked conflict in American history. When Madison does take office, something we will dive deeper into next week, he is faced with the unenviable choice of rolling over to Britain's continued flaunting of international decorum, or going to war with a nation that the U.S. really wasn't prepared to fight. Again. Thanks for listening, and hopefully now you can take pride in knowing just a little bit more about the history of the United States. Class dismissed.